Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to welcome you to Oracles. This time it's a slightly different format in that we thought it would be useful to have a bit of an open discussion in relation to our various experiences with clinical trials. So instead of having formal presentations with PowerPoint, etc., the idea is that we initiate some discussion, obviously by making some initial statements, and then it's hopefully a free-range discussion between the panel, and hopefully you will send in your questions in the way that you have done in previous times. So it falls upon me to start this as someone who has had a great deal of experience in the last 50 years with dealing with various regulatory agencies. Now, as always with English speakers, I thought I would start with an after dinner quote, which I thought was very appropriate. And that is Prince Philip's funeral, where Prince Philip said, "Ladies and gentlemen, academics in particular, please remember that the mind can only absorb what the backside can tolerate." So that was his advice for us to keep things short. Okay, well, I think we all start from the same point and agree that with the start of any new treatment or device, we need some sort of independent approval system. We absolutely need some measure of does it work, which is currently listed as efficacy. Now, again, there's a slight misunderstanding about the history of clinical trials because it's often quoted that Captain Cook on a journey to the New World was able to treat and cure scurvy. I'm afraid that's untrue. His treatment was malt and sauerkraut, which Michael, I'm sure you would approve of. Of course, it didn't work, but it fell to another naval officer, James Lind, in 1747, who conducted the first true clinical trial. And it was a great trial. It wasn't double blind, but he took 12 sailors, divided them into 6 pairs of 2, gave one lemons and not the other in the pair. And it was absolutely classic because those that were fed lemons did not succumb to scurvy, whereas many of the others did. And he published this in 1753. So that is really the first evidence of a really effective clinical trial. It was cheap, it was fast, except the Royal Navy didn't like it because lemons were expensive at the time. And so they substituted limes, which work equally well, but it was the underlying reason why the Brits are referred to in the US as limers, because they ate limes. Okay, well, that's a classic clinical trial, very simple, very fast, easy demonstration of efficacy, and very, very inexpensive. Okay, well, in the US, it took a little while, but in the late 1800s, people began to think it was a good idea to have some sort of control over efficacy. And in 1906, President Theodore Roosevelt signed off on the FDA, and their charge was efficacy. Efficacy, did it work? Now, it's very interesting that it wasn't until 1960 when we'd seen 10,000 deformed births in Europe due to taking thalidomide, and people forget this, but 20,000 patients in the US had taken thalidomide by this time because the FDA were interested in efficacy, and it was quite effective. But that was the trick that brought the FDA into safety. So now we have two criteria: does it work and is it safe? And I think that's a very interesting development. Unfortunately, the FDA now employs over 18,000 people to phone me up and annoy me. So what was a great idea has led to a huge bureaucracy. And many of you will have heard me say, from my own experience, FDA stood for funereal data analysis, because whatever I sent them, they'd take forever. More recently, it's become known as foreign development assured, because it costs so much to put things through in the US that it's much less expensive and much faster to do it outside the US. And then we've reached a situation finally where FDA stands for forget distribution in America. And that's epitomized by a great German company, Schwint, who've produced a wonderful laser, and he has no interest whatsoever in putting it through the FDA, having put it through regulatory agencies in Europe. So what's the problem with our so-called gold standard? Well, again, in my own experience, it took 10 years for the early days of refractive surgery with the development of PRK, 10 years before the FDA approved a technology that was being used throughout the rest of the world. Huge time and costs were involved to do trials, which many of us considered totally unnecessary, in the US. And a similar situation has arisen recently with crosslinking. To put riboflavin in a patient's eye and then irradiate with UV to correct some of the problems, well, some of the problems of aging, but diseases like keratoconus, 10 years, huge amounts of money and huge numbers of patients, to the point where, just like PRK, many US citizens end up going to Canada, Mexico, or even coming to UK. Now, attendant on that delaying, expensive process, we've seen the second industry. Forgive me, Chris, but we've seen the new industry of CROs and lobbying companies, which make a fortune out of interpreting FDA regulations to the rest of the world, people like myself, and then facilitating the passage through the FDA as speedily as possible, telling us that they're saving us money. I'm sure they are. But again, it's a huge industry with new costs. So are there any potential solutions? Well, I think we need to change the mindset of the bureaucrats. Remember, when I did my sabbatical in Berkeley, they discovered a new element, administratium, infinite mass and zero energy. And I'd like to stimulate the FDA into really thinking their role is progress, not process. Please don't tell me I filled the wrong forms in. Do it yourself, because you've probably got the data in front of you. Most importantly, I think we need to get all the regulatory agencies around the world to come together to agree with every new treatment or device a data requirement pool, so that whatever the trial, whether it's done in UK, Italy, Switzerland, Sweden, or America, the data is available for analysis. The decisions can be independent country decisions. But for goodness sake, let's stop repeating clinical trial after clinical trial at the same cost, and none of them come up with information that the others haven't come up with. So I would urge that we really look at that. They've got to do something about speeding in time. Now, in post-approval surveillance that we now have, again, it's going to be absolutely huge attendant cost. They've got to come up with a matrix to show us of the time base. If you put an intraocular lens in an eye that works exceedingly well, after 5 years, it may not work as well. Is that because the lens is fatiguing or the patient is aging? We need some sort of framework before we get hit with regulatory mechanisms that at the moment we have no real knowledge for. So I'm going to stop there, but just remember President Kennedy's inauguration speech. Success has many fathers. Failure is an orphan. So no one wants to actually do some of these things that I'm suggesting, but I really think we've got to get off our backsides, lobby the various agencies and try to get something moving, please. Sorry, I'll shut up now.
Well, yeah, John, I think especially your point about coordination of data, and I think Lee can speak to this as well. But in our roles, what Med Device does is advise and guide companies through the European clinical process, regulatory approval process. We spend a lot of time explaining, no, you can't use that. Great, you have data from Latin America, different parts of the world. You're going to have European data. And the argument is always why, because we've done X, Y, and Z. And what the regulators have come to is that they want some reassurance that the clinical data that's in that original study, no matter where it emanates from, can be replicated in Europe in European patients. And I think that goes a lot to what you're seeing now, is this need to make sure that there's that the data is repeatable. Rightly or wrongly, but I think that is the underlying message, because especially in Europe, if you look at ophthalmology in particular, there's been things that have come to market that have not worked out well, and have resulted in ophthalmologists being more skeptical, et cetera. And so I think that as also translates over into the regulatory side, and what the regulators want is to see more real world evidence and data before they approve a product to market.
I agree with you, Chris. What I'm trying to say is, I don't believe German eyes are different from UK eyes, and they are different from Swedish eyes. I think if we agreed a dynamic for a given trial to test a given product or a given pharmaceutical, which had input from the FDA, MRA, MRHA, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, then that should go some way, certainly go some way to saving companies from going bust. The bit that I'm not quite sure about, and I'd like your advice here, is who polices this? I've come across this in laser safety, etc. We come up with a wonderful set of regs to protect people from lasers. And then in UK, at one time, it was left with the local council, what I call rat catchers, the guys that go and measure petrol in petrol stations, etc., who have no understanding of the radiation, etc. And there doesn't seem to be a mechanism other than the medical CROs, is it the people that actually go in and view the data? That's great, but I'm not quite sure who employs those. And that is, to my mind, a bit of a failing. If you look at the French breast implant situation, which has lumbered us with a lot of new regulations, regulations for the design were there, everything was there. It's just the manufacturer just chose to ignore it. And nobody caught on that things were going wrong until poor women had terrible medical problems. So I don't know, who polices it? Who polices the police?
Well, from a European standpoint, under MDR, it's the notified bodies, which are hired by the companies and who are now in the position where they have to basically police their clients. And it is a bit of a complex situation. And then it deals, within the notified bodies, they're feeding into their country competent authority. So it definitely, MDR was meant to simplify things, but in actuality, it's probably made things more complicated because you have the notified bodies having a much higher degree of responsibility and authority than they did, under the device directive. So, Lee, I'm curious to hear what you think as being based in Europe, but focusing on the US, and what, your, especially your previous involvement, working for the FDA, where, how your view of where we are today. And, as to John's point, is there a way forward to harmonize things?
Well, thank you. First, in terms of data repositories, one thing John had mentioned is always important to remember is it a fair assumption that you can extrapolate results from different regions to different countries? And so, for example, FDA has a list of things to consider when you want to try to bring OUS data to the US FDA. And they can be overcome. You have to explain the nature of differences in ethnicity, patient demographics, practice patterns around the particular therapy. So it does get questioned, but you can often explain why, in fact, it's reasonable to bring in data from other sources into the US, for example. But even once you get past the question of applicability, there's the question of harmonization is a double-edged sword, because if in fact harmonization makes it such that the requirements basically have to reach the highest bar. So let's suppose for a second the US FDA is the highest bar. If essentially everybody was to come to an agreement that the same body of data should support multiple geographies, you could be in a place where you're going to need to do far more for a particular region only because you're using a data set that happened to be more substantial because you were trying to basically meet the highest bar. So what I'm also getting to is FDA's involvement in ISO standards has led to their voice being very loud in these meetings. And I think you know this well, John. And what can happen is everybody would like full alignment and agreement that in fact they've defined the standard set of clinical data requirements. And what I found though is FDA telling me recently there's parts of an ISO standard they didn't agree with, they don't recognize. And so what it shows you is that when you get a very conservative regulatory body involved, coming to a consensus is difficult. But even if you come to a consensus, it could be that all you've done is raise the bar for going to Europe, let's say, because whereas before the bar might have been more modest, where it needed to be, had you followed that model. But by getting everybody to agree, it could very well be that the FDA becomes the rate limiting step, so to speak. So I have more to say about the idea of where we can progress in terms of harmonization and getting collaboration better in defining clinical trial design. But I just wanted to start there because I could see some downsides if everybody were to try to follow
my question is, or my statement was, we would get all regulatory agencies to agree a protocol for a given new therapeutic, a new pharmaceutical or a new device. But each country, each regulatory agency would have powers of decision and discretion of their own. So all I'm asking for is, please stop us having to do multiple trials for the same thing when much of the data is already identical. We know that different countries are going to make decisions in different ways, and I don't think that will ever happen. So if it would just be if we could collectively collate data that then each regulatory agency said, okay, well, great trial, but we won't sanction it until the following's done, or this or that or something else. And this would just reduce costs instead of having to start from scratch each time. And it is phenomenal costs. I mean, we're looking now at millions for a trial. And one of the reasons we don't have lots of new antibiotics is not because the companies haven't developed them, they have. It's just too costly to put them through regulatory approval. And the thing I didn't mention was that clearly things can be done, because COVID went through the FDA in months. Now, this is several brand new vaccines, messenger RNA, adulterating, attenuating the baseline of the virus, DNA, and yet within the space of, it seemed to me, 6 to 8 months, we've got approval. And the data was collected with AstraZeneca. Much of the data was collected in UK and in other European countries, which the FDA accepted. And Pfizer, most of the work was done in the US, which the FDA accepted. So somehow or other, the regulators are moving. They are realizing they can't forever cause these delays. And perhaps it's only if the patient's going to die that they can move quickly. But I thought that was very impressive how quickly they did move. When we wanted approval for our screening test in Menlo Park, 8 days to get approval for a screening test. Amazing. Never thought that would happen.
I'm curious, Michael, as somebody who's chairman, CEO of companies that has to run clinical studies and is looking at some FDA work coming up, what's your viewpoint on the requirements that companies face these days?
So John first started a very interesting question, who has an interest in all these regulations? And I think he mentioned, the notified bodies, the regulators that, if you're a regulator, what you want to do, you want to regulate more. It's your job. I think I want to bring in also perspective of the larger industry. I remember when the MDR started to get into discussion because of the breast implant situation, the local countries formed groups, industry advisory panels for the MDR process. And I was trying to get on the panel. What I realized is, you have to have a couple of thousand employees to be on that list.
Yeah.
And I had a couple of conversations with my notified body about that. And he said, their only interest of the big industry is to make this process more complicated. Because in Europe, yes, you have IP, you can protect yourself. But the other protection you can form as a big company is actually make the barrier of entry to the market much higher, which in the US, if you look at the US market, and I can mainly speak about ophthalmology, but there's hardly no small and medium-sized enterprise active in the market. It's all the big players. If you go to Europe today, it's, I think still 60% of the volume is done by small and medium-sized enterprises.
Yeah.
Like Mr. Schwind, you mentioned that example. Excellent technology, excellent company based in Germany, innovative product. But now, if and I'm making this up now, but if I'm an Alcon, if I'm a J&J, this is a competitor which, I can fight on patents, which, in certain markets, the patents are running out. Excimer laser, hard to find patents to block someone today because all the patents are running out. So the next barrier I can build for Mr. Schwind is increase the level for new product approvals through the regulatory office massively. And I think that's what we saw with the MDR. Companies like Siemens, Braun, big, huge medtech companies had a big influence in the MDR to make that entry barrier much higher. That small and medium-sized companies having a big struggle. And I think what we're going to see is moving forward over the next years is, on one hand, what we're going to see is big companies are going to clean up their portfolio from products that they don't like and that they have margin. And I think that's already happening. And we're also going to see either small companies can be consolidated into something bigger, or they will be gone from the market. I think that's kind of what that regulation change in Europe is going to lead to. Now, and I think we start seeing initial things. Now, COVID has probably delayed everything, and MDR was delayed. So, but I think my projection here is small companies, either they have the big VC backup to get it done, like a startup, and get through this process, or they're kind of going to deal in certain niche markets where maybe there's an orphan application in future where they found their niche that the big guys are not interested in, and the rest will just die, or be acquired by a big strategic. So I think and then back to your question, Chris, is how I see this as a small company being involved mainly in small companies. I have to secure that I have the liquidity and the cash in the bank to go through this process and make myself attractive to be acquired into a big organization. I think that's and then we're back to a similar model like in the US. You form a startup, you raise a lot of cash, either you do an IPO, you're big enough to survive in the market, or you're going to be acquired by a big one, or you're dead. But that small, medium-sized approach, I think, is unfortunately, because I'm a big fan of it, is probably going to be very difficult in the industry moving forward.
And Michael, do you think in much the same way as effectively the FDA drove a lot of R&D and small companies out of the US to do their first-in-man trials in Europe, and now we're beginning to see a second wave where we're now moving towards Asia, Taiwan, etc. So that foreign development assured is now slipping into other parts of the world, and it's been induced, it's really been forced upon us because of regulatory costs. Not that we don't agree that we need a measure of efficacy and a measure of safety, it's just the cost of doing it in such an inefficient manner. Sorry, Lee.
But maybe quickly to this point is, when I got into ophthalmology, first in human use was, the patient was not seen in the night, brought to the clinic. Today, if you want to do first in human use in Europe, well, it's become a huge barrier. And as a startup, how are you going to raise the money for first in human use? Effectively, everyone has asked you, do you have clinical data? Do you have clinical data? So what is your option? The option is go to India, go to other countries in the world, to like US goes to Mexico or to South America. I think we're going to say the same thing. So is it really protecting patients for early stage technology? No, we just took that out of the face from Europe and moved it into other regions of the world.
And PhD students are no longer animals. I always thought they'd be between humans and animals. And one of my students said, Prof, in your lab, I've come across, you've given me so many weird things over the years, that PhD stands for potatoes heal diarrhea. I said, what? I didn't say that.
Well, I just one little defense of the MDR, Michael. From a cost standpoint, getting into the requirements for doing a first in human feasibility study in Europe have not changed under MDR. Where MDR has a more dramatic impact is post CE mark. But getting a clinical study up and running in Europe hasn't changed. Where the cost, and it's after, but it's also the notified body costs and things like that have added on to the price tag. I think we should bring in our lone clinician on today's webinar, Sufi, and get your take on this as somebody who's involved in clinical studies and works with new technology. Your thoughts, please.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. I'm mostly here to learn from the masters, but I would add, it's not only a waste of money, it is unethical to repeat the same experiments again and again, and to expose patients to inferior treatments that have been proven to be inferior in other parts of the world. And also the delay that is caused by too high of a standard is preventing patients from getting state-of-the-art medicine. John mentioned crosslinking, for instance. It is ridiculous that it took 10 years to be approved in the FDA, from the FDA, and so many people had their vision diminished and irreversibly deteriorated because there was no approved treatment. So I think we have to find a solution that on the one hand allows for a faster process, and then also has a defined follow-up after approval. And approval may be withdrawn if this product or this type of surgery is not effective and safe after approval. So I forgot the, I think there is something like if you, in the past, then FDA approval is much easier. Maybe you can comment on that. And because of that, if you have a predecessor, it is much easier to get approved. And even if your product is not very well thought out, I forgot this specific.
510K, I think.
That's right.
Equivalency.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
Yep.
I agree.
Yeah, I think I could speak a little bit to that, both clinical and regulatory, and I won't get into the details on the class 2 510K framework, but there is that notion of a predicate device, equivalent technology, and what evidentiary bar comes with that. So the clinical data requirements are lowered in the US to a large extent if you have a good predicate, and so you're not demonstrating benefit risk from the ground up, you're somewhat leveraging the known history of a certain device. So there's this predicate idea that does moderate the clinical data requirements. Just listening to everything that was said, the trajectory is clear in terms of people expecting better clinical research. So trial design, the idea of more robustness, it seems to be a trend that will not be changing anytime soon. But I think it comes to a matter of, because my consulting work is negotiation on what's a reasonable amount of pre-market data. And that's really what we're talking about, by the way, is the balance between pre-market and post-market. FDA is saying they're willing to think more about what is the appropriate balance and defer some questions to a post-market, but there's a lot more behind that, and it hasn't come to fruition quite yet. What I would say, though, in terms of negotiating the pre-market study design, what I'm finding is the difficulty is taking each client individually to have a negotiation when they work in the same space, essentially. What I'm finding is the progress that's been made in clinical research leading to FDA approval has been accomplished through consensus and collaboration at the committees, the input to FDA guidance. There was an AGS workshop on MIGS devices. That workshop led to an FDA guidance. And what it allows the agency to do is get comfortable with putting out recommendations on trial design that's more modest and appropriate, because they've had external stakeholders come to them and discuss in an earnest way what is the appropriate amount of pre-market data. And so I would just say, in terms of our audience today, people who may be involved in clinical research, but also in regulatory, is just think about the opportunities to talk in a format that allows people to come to a reasonable agreement on what's needed, And then that becomes a recipe for people to follow. Because one of the themes in preparing for today's webinar that we had talked about was just predictability and the anticipating the requirements and having some predictability. But with that comes the need to be able to look at prior FDA decisions and say, okay, well, that's a model to follow. Or if you have a new technology, does FDA have a willingness to accept a plan because other stakeholders have come together and saying this is an appropriate type of clinical study? So I'll just mention corneal cross-linking real quick in the FDA. If you look at the panel transcript for that product, and it's publicly available, there was a lot of debate about the trial design and the conduct of that study. But what everybody can agree, the sponsors, FDA, doctors, is that everybody would have loved a different trial design in an ideal world. But there's the practical and then there's the ideal. The practical is what I'm describing, is everybody getting to a place where harmonization is the result of consensus on trial design. And I'm talking about endpoints. You know, is there a novel way to measure a therapeutic outcome? There's a lot of debate with FDA on the drug and device side. What's the best way to establish effectiveness for some novel technologies? What's the appropriate length of follow-up? If you're going to do a post-market study anyway, how much pre-market follow-up do you need versus continuing follow-up in the post-market? You know, the different study arms you might do. What's the appropriate control and sample size? I mean, all of these clinical back to the idea that there's time and money being spent and it's keeping therapies from patients. As I see it, the way to overcome that is to everybody agree what is the right balance and pre-market and post-market, but it involves people being involved, engaged. There's different formats you can get involved. You know, if you're a clinical research and you have an opinion about how to, you know, investigate a product, take some time and try to speak up in some of these venues. FDA has an open mind, I just want to say, about a lot of things. But that open-mindedness is really improved when it's stakeholders, not just the companies negotiating, but stakeholders in academia and in clinical research, people who can say, what are the practical problems with what you're describing, you know, in terms of the burden for a company to undertake. So, you know, I just want to say that I think we all recognize the problem, and even FDA will recognize the problem. You essentially create this regulatory barrier where small and medium companies likely can't see it all the way through, but certainly the big companies can. And so, but if everybody can get to an agreement as to what is the appropriate amount of data, you could see a more modest budget being associated with clinical trial design, some more predictability, less time. You know, years of negotiation would be quickly shortened if you kind of knew what to go in and propose from the outset. And that's really the work we do.
Okay, but Lee, if you take 2 points of what you've just said, with cross-linking, you had literally hundreds of thousands of patients treated around the world, hundreds of thousands. The FDA weren't interested. They wanted they wanted Avidro to do a clinical trial in the US, a multi-center trial in the US. Now, to my mind, a Cochrane analysis of hundreds of thousands of patients would have served that purpose. But we couldn't do it. In fact, we had to build a micro-pharmaceutical company to import a German product into the US because the German company weren't interested in FDA approval in any kind. So that cost us just over $20 million to make a micro-pharmaceutical company in order to take their product through 6 phases with penny clipboard from the FDA checking that we were doing it to get back to where the Germans had started from so that we could put these in patients' eyes. I mean, that to me was absolutely ludicrous. The second element, I agree 510K was a very, very useful route, but it was so hit and miss. For example, when the dye laser was introduced, you had argon in the green and krypton in the red, and the FDA 510K, all the wavelengths throughout the visible. no check, nothing, just bang, we got it. And then when we wanted to do a frequency double diode, as opposed to YAG, wow, we had to do an IDE, and that also from the outside is very difficult to understand. So I hear what you're saying, but it would just be absolutely lovely if we could have a forum, if the FDA ran an annual forum of Cochrane analysis, for example. Let's take all the data available from tens, if not hundreds of thousands of patients around the world and see if we come up with a consensus from that data. Sure, there may be holes in it, but at least it should speed things up and make for very much faster trials. I mean, I would love, and I think you're partially converted, but I would love to sit down, as with Michael and others that have experienced this with the FDA, not with their bureaucratic hats on, but to actually say, look, guys, this is the problem. These are what we'd like you to do.
But John, I think along that line, I think also there seems to be a flaw in that concept. And I think what we observed with the raindrop from revision optics, I mean, it was dead in Europe. Patients were harmed. Reports were given to authorities that there's adverse events with cornea melts.
Yeah.
And the FDA approves the product. And then about 12 months later, pulls the plug and does a recall.
Yeah.
I mean, so all this work, all this money, I didn't see the value that this has saved any patient from any harm. So I really don't. That's my conflict that I don't understand. Okay, I understand they want to make the check boxes. I understand that they may want to have in certain ethnic groups different clinical data. Kind of buy those things. Free world data are sometimes not reliable in terms of can I trust these data? Where do these data come? How these data were generated? So I think it can make a lot of arguments. Just a side comment: I compared our cross-linking data that we generated back, in Dresden with the FDA results, and hey, surprised it gave the same results. But anyway, that's a detail. But that failure with revision optic, that it was clearly dead in Japan, in Europe, and it got approved by the FDA. It's just for me that is an example that this process we're using at the moment has flaws and can fail in protecting patient safety. And that's where it's difficult for me to understand. If that all would lead to better safety for our patients, I would agree, but obviously it doesn't. And that's where my biggest struggle is with understanding.
Michael, failure is an orphan. None of us are responsible. It's like the MIGs. When you saw the beginnings of data coming from the rest of the world of endothelial cell counts down, it took the FDA a bloody long time before they did their announcement. Sorry, Lee, we're not personalizing this.
Oh, of course not.
No, but isn't it interesting though that as somebody who works in Europe and works routinely with MHRA in the UK, BfArM in Germany, very rigorous processes, very close oversight. Why it is an interesting question to ask as to why these agencies are not cooperating more or finding opportunities to cooperate more because of that basic interest that Michael said, patient safety.
Yeah.
And I think it in some respects you have to think about MDR. The reason we have MDR the way it is because countries were looking to protect their turf and their competent authorities, so we end up with 27 competent authorities, able to move instead of one agency like EMA. But is it down to the fact that each country wants to protect its turf? And is that more important than patient safety? Or is there some level of sanity that starts to come in here soon that gets these agencies working together more quickly?
I don't actually understand. Perhaps Lee can explain. In Europe, certainly in UK, the agency has taxpayers' money, and then it can charge for conducting, or rather supervising, a trial, etc. Who pays for the FDA? I mean, there's 18,000 people there.
The manufacturers.
The companies?
It's a combination of congressional funding and user fees, and that's a whole source of debate. And it is a surprise to the American public when they hear that the studies themselves are funded by the agency or the sponsors, because they think that's an inherent conflict of interest. But the size of the studies and everything else, you could debate that all the time. I mean, but I just want to say on the recalls that were mentioned, if anything, on the one hand, you can say what it didn't, in the two recalls I'm referring to are the CyPass and the RVO raindrop. On the one hand, you can say it was a failure of the FDA pre-market system because they were approved and subsequently recalled. But the problem is, from the FDA side, they can look at it and say, well, it's actually a reason why we should require longer follow-up, because we might have detected these problems had we done more than a 2-year endpoint. And so you can imagine how, kind of distasteful that idea is, to do 5 years pre-market studies, right? So those two examples are actually difficult to reconcile with the FDA framework, because you're right. They asked for all that time and money to be spent only to recall it. But on the other hand, it could have led them to say, you know what, maybe we need to be more conservative. We need more pre-market data to avoid recalls. And on that, I just want to say too about post-market actions and recalls. One of the reasons why the whole pre-market, post-market balance hasn't come to fruition is because there aren't a lot of teeth on post-market actions, believe it or not. There's a reason to believe that it's, the reason we call it voluntary recall is because that's exactly what it is. The company has to voluntarily recall the product. And in the case of the CyPass program, you saw what happened there. But imagine a scenario where there was a signal and Alcon didn't voluntarily recall it. What would it have taken for there to be a forceful recall? Right? I mean, there could have been a debate about specular microscopy versus corneal decompensation. So anyway, I just wanted to say that in post-market surveillance, if it were stronger in the US and it was reliable, that you could pick up a signal early, I think there's a scenario where the pre-market studies could be faster if there was actually a great deal of confidence in post-market surveillance and the reliability of those detection tools. Yep. And I'll just say big data, one of the biggest chances for big data to solve the world's problems is to solve the puzzle of how to detect signals out of their pharmaceuticals and drug devices in the post-market. Because if you give the regulators like FDA the confidence that they're going to pick up something they need to pick up earlier, the pre-market studies won't be a 5-year endpoint or a 2-year endpoint. They're going to be able to say, well, we have enough, and then what we'll do is watch what happens. But I can just tell you there's a real skepticism at FDA on the reliability of post-market data. And I'll just say, in the case of the RVO submission to FDA, within every PMA, there's a marketing history, a commercial marketing history. So as much as maybe FDA doesn't talk to all the other worldwide agencies, to Chris's point, what they do have is the sponsor of that file submitting to them all the complaints and MDRs that were worldwide around their global marketing history. And so when you look at it that way, yet they still approved the RVO inlay. So again, you could come up with a scenario where, had the post-market vigilance been closer outside of the US, that they wouldn't have approved it, because they would have said, well, look, there's something more here than was evident in their pre-market study. And so it wouldn't have been approved in the US. But anyway, I just want to say the theme for everybody to be thinking about is, how do what can we all do to move forward? Because we all recognize the problem. And I mentioned earlier, working within the committees, professional societies, preferred practice groups, to come up with what is an appropriate way to clinically evaluate a technology. And secondarily, what I was just saying, how can we all be thinking about the post-market surveillance world to give FDA and other agencies more confidence, so that they don't require an overly burdensome pre-market study. And to the point about cross-linking, it's similar to that idea. There was a worldwide body of data to bring to FDA, but they, aside from the geography question, they have a real question about what was the consistency in the protocols in terms of the drug and device settings. Let's say, what was the endpoint measured consistently in the same way? Were there protocol deviations? Was there loss to follow-up? Anyway, the rigor around real-world evidence and post-market data can be limited in FDA's mind. So the question is, how do you bridge that? How do you bring data to them that is somewhat resembles pre-market data, in the more traditional randomized controlled study, the highest level of evidence? You would really need to find a way for them to move past the randomized controlled study of 500, 600 people into a reliable body of data through these tools that might be developed on database, basically what.
But that's basically what Cochrane analyses do. Cochrane studies do exactly that. They take 10,000, they take 100,000, they look at the overall efficacy, and then they sort of list the differences. But if the overall efficacy says, crikey, this works, that would be really quite dramatic. I mean, my father always said to me, son, if you need statistics, you've done the wrong experiment. And it took me a long time to realize what he meant by that. But now I appreciate with Cochrane and AI, big databases are incredibly useful. Michael, you
yeah, I think I joined this year the Future Health meeting in Basel, which is Novartis and all the big pharma guys coming together. It's a meeting with about 200 people, but very focused on exactly what we're discussing. What are we going to do with these clinical data? And even a company like Novartis is doing studies all over the world, and they start working on consolidated databases. But their conclusion is, how can we make this more effective? Is a combination of looking at the big data on the real world data, identifying the gaps, where do we have open questions, and then do the study designs accordingly. And saying, okay, here's an unclear answer. Let's make a focus study on, with a limited numbers of patients to answer exactly that question. And that seems to be what big pharma considers as the benefit and the future of clinical trials. Now, how long it takes to be that absorbed by regulators, that's something, I'm not a politician, but for me, that made perfect sense. Take the real world data, identify the flaws, identify the gaps, and then design the studies to answer particular questions to add to the database you get from big data. I thought that was a really remarkable pathway. And I think, if we want to look into the future, I think that's what we're going to see is that your post-market surveillance should be collecting pretty much every patient. You derive back from that, you derive certain study protocols or certain hypotheses that you then test in very focused formal studies. And I think that's what I would like to see, because then we have the two worlds together. And I think that would be my answer to that problem. Now, again, I'm not a politician, but I think that makes, for me, from my perspective, that makes sense.
Yeah. No, I absolutely agree with you. And I think that addresses one of the current problems with trials, which I'm sure you'll appreciate, Lee. We're all forced to do clinical trials before we really finish dose analysis and ranging. So very often, when we're still doing pilot studies, we're going to go bust if we don't actually go to a clinical trial, and we go to a clinical trial on the basis of a limited pilot study, which may not be optimal in terms of dosage. And then we're locked into that. We can't change it. We can't wriggle out of it. And even when we see at a point that it is inappropriate and we really do need to do something about our dosage, we can't do it. So Michael's right. If we can look at the big field of world data and say, okay, well, the holes are here, here, and here, that would again save a lot of time and money, Michael. I was thinking, Chris and I have just been through the most excruciating experience getting a paper published on regulatory issues. Okay, I'm sure.
Yeah, you want to talk about regulatory barriers.
I think it's taken over a year, hasn't it, Chris?
Yes, yeah, we started in May 2020.
Yeah, because I was going to suggest, Michael, it might be a really good idea if you, myself, Chris and Lee, and Sophie put together a sort of wish list, some of the stuff that we've been covering here, to actually present to the various regulatory authorities and say, look, we're little mice beavering away at the shop front, but this is what we've come up against, and these are some of our suggestions. Help.
Yeah, manifesto.
Chris will do this.
Oh, yeah. Chris will get somebody to write it. Yes, that's it.
But I think I don't want to leave the audience here and ask why I think we got a little bit of a negative point of view here on doing clinical trials and all for the regulatory purpose, which is really disappointing. Yeah, and I appreciate, and I think I fully agree with everything discussed here. But I would like to discuss maybe a little bit at the end is what's the value of doing it? I mean, aside from getting a regulatory approval. And for the purpose of this call, I actually looked up is if you compare medtech companies when they were R&D focused versus more operational focused, their growth rates and their revenue streams and the potentials are much higher if they focusing on R&D side.
Yeah.
And I think the big shift we're going to see, and I think the IT industry and the big data industry and artificial is a good example, is in the past we had a lot of physical value. We bought a lens, we bought a hardware, we bought a computer. Now that value is changing to intangible values. And one of the big intangible value in our industry is clinical data. And I think that's where the opportunity lies. So if you're a clinician, you're interested in clinical trials, you're involved in clinical trials, you enjoy this, keep in mind, you're helping also to create a lot of value. And I think that's the other side of the coin is, because of these regulations, because of the burden that companies have, every single patient you treat and you generate data has value. And I think, we talked about big data. I'm hearing a lot of discussions that the big corporates, Microsoft and Apple and Google, they're thinking about models, how they actually will pay for your clinical data of your patients.
We're already in those negotiations at Moorfields. Moorfields has this huge database. We see somewhere between 12 and 1,500 patients every day. And that is now a commodity. Okay. Forget the fact that the data belongs to the patient, not the hospital, but collectively.
But John, where I would say is even for the patient, down to the patient and to the single physicians, there will be in future business models.
Absolutely.
That will remonetize you or give you any, let's say, financial benefit if you are willing to share your data.
Yeah,
whether it's token that you can buy a cheaper ice cream around the corner or some Bitcoin or whatever it is, there will be future models where we get much higher quality of big data. And I think that's a bit where my future hope lies. First of all, is it has a huge value. That's number one. And second, it will streamline potentially those approval processes.
Michael, what you said brings to mind is in terms of incentives and big data, the closest thing I've seen to what we're talking about is the Academy of Ophthalmology's IRIS database as it relates to the partnership with Verana Health. Because I was excited to see that, because what it told me was that if Verana Health can figure out how to make the platform for my clients to collect pre-market and post-market data, so there's an incentive from the doctors to want to enter their data, then that data could be powerful for these regulatory conversations, because you then have the platform to collect this important information and have these conversations on reliability of consistency and data collection reliability. That's the closest thing I've seen, and I still hope that it's going to prove its value over time, because I think that is really, when you talk about its value, its value is not just to the manufacturers and the doctors, but in terms of the global health question, I wanted to say that back to the why we want to do clinical trials, and the value is building confidence in these products. So every time there's a recall or there's a Netflix special about medical device disasters, you're undermining doctors and patients' confidence in new technology. So if you can give everybody the comfort that clinical data has been appropriately collected, I think there's better adoption and market potential. Because what John mentioned earlier on COVID vaccinations, I just want to say, some of the resistance to those vaccinations has been they were under the EUA framework in the US. And so people interpret that to mean shortcuts, right? And they interpret to mean that they shouldn't get it, there shouldn't be requirements to have vaccinations until it gets a fully authorized approval. So of course, everybody agrees that the speed of the vaccines was important, but the double-edged sword is if it left 50% of people saying there wasn't enough data and they're hesitating, it sort of explains why we're in this mess. And I'm not second guessing the ways around it. I'm just saying that the reality is you have people claiming that expedited pathway is a good reason not to be vaccinated.
Yeah. And I think, to the point about, looking at the clinical studies from a positive viewpoint under MDR, one of the positives to me is the fact that where once companies were able to do a 10 patient safety study, 1 month data submitted, boom, they got their CE mark. Now companies are required to do meaningful studies that look at safety and efficacy and have well-constructed endpoints. And the conversation that we always have with companies is, what else do you want to get from that data? What are your marketing claims? What do you need to get reimbursement? And so our goal with clients is to build as strong and robust clinical study as possible that allows them to get everything that they need from that clinical study. And when we're working with Lee on we're having conversations about, what's the US requirement, what's the EU requirement, and we're trying to anticipate and think about those things. So I think MDR has some of benefits because it has raised that bar for especially class 2A and above products. And it will start to, as Michael said, knock some companies out because they're not going to be willing to do that. But that may ultimately benefit clinicians and patients.
Just to put things back in perspective, 1747, 12 patients totally changed the situation in terms of scurvy. I wonder how much that trial cost. And I wonder how many bureaucrats were involved in that. We've come a long way and things are more complicated,
But John, be careful. That had a particular purpose because they wanted to go through the US to assure that the US creates the FDA and creates Apple, Google, and Microsoft. And Amazon now.
Okay, I'll go to the Greenwich Naval College and actually find out the costs, but I'm sure it wasn't very expensive.
Report back.
I think a question that I always get, from younger ophthalmologists, hey, Michael, I want to be involved in clinical studies and everything. So I want to work with companies. I think my general answer is get them reliable data that they can trust.
Yeah.
And that's for me very simple because I think that's the future of an ophthalmologist, whether he is involved in formal clinical trials or in his daily work. The more we can give our joint industry reliable data, the more everyone will benefit. And whether it's going to be Google or someone else who's going to collect these data and make it into a commercial thing, that's probably step 2. But I think it starts with the qualified data and everything we're doing.
Absolutely, Michael, and that's why we've got Sufi here.
I was just going to say, that's why, from my standpoint, we go to Sufi. People say, oh, you see the same doctors on the podium over and over again. The reason that they're used is because we know that going into a clinical study, we want a sure bet, we want a sure thing. And the clinical sites that deliver are the ones that, companies, CROs go back to over and over again.
Yeah.
And I know it's the same in the US, with clinical centers as well.
Michael, did you not pay your electricity bill? You've suddenly gone very.
He's outside.
I'm 2 hours ahead of you. I'm in Istanbul.
All right, okay. It's very dark.
Yeah, it's almost
then-
nighttime there.
Then I'm in my outside office, which actually literally I don't have light. So sorry about that.
Now that's another good book. Let There Be Light. It starts, and the FDA should look at that one too.
All right. Well, we're kind of winding down here, and are there any final points that you guys want to make? Maybe starting with Sufi, and then we can head into this webinar's edition of Wine of the Webinar.
Yeah,
So,
I would
Sufi?
love to start. Yeah, thank
Okay.
you, Chris. I have to admit I am much more confused than before this webinar, but on a significantly higher level.
Job done. Okay. Michael?
I think we had a great discussion about the confusion that exists between the real world data and the clinical trials and the world industry is living, the manufacturers are living in to get through approval process. And I think the clinician side sometimes have to appreciate and learn better what that means to be a manufacturer and getting through this jungle of regulatory sites and hurdles. And on the other hand, I think I'm a true believer in the value of clinical data, not only from a regular purpose, also from a marketing claim purpose. And I think also, it has the value of seeing where the opportunities in future in the market. And I think that's for me why I think we need to get excellent clinical data, share the data, and make it visible to the outside world. That's for me the take-home message from my point.
Thanks, Michael. Lee?
I'll just say something for the audience, another take-home message that's important, and it's related to a development at FDA around acceptance of foreign data. They created a final rule that makes it more emphatic that if you want to bring foreign data to the US to represent it as being valid, there's state certifications that you need to make, statements that confirm that it was collected according to good clinical practice, ethical guidelines, and regulatory requirements. The reason I'm mentioning that is because in terms of clinical researchers recognizing the value of the data, it's recognizing the conditions under which those data are collected. So what is going to hold the most value when it comes time to bring to FDA. And so I just want to say that if you talk to a CRO or a consultant about doing a clinical study, keep in mind that there are certain ways to do these studies that are going to yield greater value. And what I mean is, for example, how to collect IOP in a glaucoma study. If you can say that you collected IOP in a certain way, it's going to have more value. And then in terms of adhering to a protocol, good clinical practices, all of that is going to win the day. I'll just put it another way. The biggest shame I see is when a small manufacturer brings to me foreign data and they say, we think we're ready to move forward with FDA. And I look at the study design and the way the analyses have been done, and I have to tell them, it's not going to hold a lot of weight when you first go talk to FDA. And had you come to me or another expert in your regionally where you work, and you had asked, what is the type of study I should be looking at? And I'm not talking about a huge investment in terms of consulting. I'm talking about simply what document should I look at so that I do if I collect the type of data, if I'm going to help a company collect data, what type of assessment should I be doing so it really holds that value in the future. So anyway, I just want to say that's one of the biggest problems I see is data collected OUS that aren't going to achieve what they need to achieve. And if you anticipate that, again, this is all about recognizing a problem and anticipating it, you can do everybody a favor early on in development.
Okay, thanks, Lee. Professor Marshall, any last words?
Well, I think we have had a great discussion. And I think we're in general agreement. I would like someone from the FDA to go and look at the Statue of Liberty in relation to foreign data, etc. Give us your report, etc., etc. So please, there is another a series of lands outside the FDA, and people are good at collecting data. But no, I think it's been very useful, and thank you for organizing it, Chris. I think it. Woo.
Oh, what that was.
Sounds like a dog, and I haven't trodden on anything my end. Okay, no, and I really do think we should build on this and perhaps put something together, limited or otherwise, to summarize the thoughts in general and how collectively, with the collective experience, we could perhaps influence the future. So thank you, everybody.
John, last question, very quick question. How many sailors died on the German sauerkraut in the study?
Well, that was another thing. Actually, slightly more on Cook's treatment than died from eating rats. Sailors used to eat rats because rats have the capacity to make their own vitamin C. So actually, they got vitamin C from rats. but we didn't recommend that.
No, we don't.
I forgot to thank you all for the invitation to be part of this group. And so I'd be glad to talk to you again on other topics, and it was really a nice chat.
Great.
Thanks so much, Lee.
Thank you, Lee.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you guys. Okay, we're going to head out to the vineyards of Napa, and where we're going to join Professor Garrett Alfarth and Dr. Vance Thompson, where they are sampling a 2018 Merlot. So enjoy.
So shall we move on? Because
Yes.
yes, a lot to work here.
Yeah. Well, and I am a big fan of Merlot. I mean, we talk about the 5 Bordeaux varietals, again, tipping our hat to France. This is our Jessup cellars. This is where we got our start in the wine business, my medical school classmate and I. And the Cabernet Sauvignon, is, considered the king. And Cabernet Franc, though, is the father of Cabernet Sauvignon. And we actually just drank the mother of Cabernet Sauvignon, and that's, Sauvignon Blanc.
Mm.
But the other Bordeaux varietals, Malbec and Petit Verdot and Merlot, are all just wonderful and are oftentimes used in various blends. And as far as the themes of our wine business, Jessup Cellars is actually more about the art of the blend. And you may have noticed that this doesn't taste like 100% Merlot. It actually does have some blending. And in the Napa Valley, you have to use at least 75% of a single varietal to call it that varietal. But then after that, you can blend with other fruit or wine grapes, but they still need to be from the Napa Valley if you're going to put Napa Valley on your label. And so there's a little bit of Cabernet Sauvignon in this, and there's actually a little bit of Petit Syrah.
Oh, okay.
And we absolutely love Petit Syrah. We use it as a blending grape. There's only 3.7% of Petit Syrah in here.
And
but
what
we
does
love
it give it? What direction does it give the whole composition?
It gives it probably a little bit more dark fruit characteristics, like plum or blackberry.
There's also some smell of like black cherry or something, I would say. But I think that's typical Merlot, yeah.
And so this is aged 22 months in French oak, 40% new French oak. And so an oak barrel, and you've been in wineries or breweries where you see wooden vessels from 100 or 200 years ago. So as long as an oak vessel is cared for, it's timeless. But as far as an oak barrel, after, 3 to 5 years, it starts to lose enough of its oak influence that it becomes more like a neutral vessel. And so if you did this Merlot with a 100% new French oak, it probably would be rather tight. And it would probably need another decade of aging or extended decanting to start to realize the beauty of it. And so winemaking techniques really will influence when a wine's ready to be released. And so our business is mainly a direct-to-consumer business where upon release, our wines are tasted in a tasting room. And I think one of the reasons our wine club has been popular is after 2 years in a barrel, and we bottle it for another year, so now we're releasing it 3 years later. If it had 100% new oak, it would be hard for anybody but a professional to really understand what it's going to become in 10 years or 15 years or 20 years. And so winemaking techniques really matter. And you and I have both tasted Merlots and Cabernets from France that were 30 and 40 years old and were stunning. They would bring tears to your eyes. But that's a different business. That's a different way to do it. Because I believe these bold fruits of the Napa Valley are ready so early. And it's one of the reasons the Napa Valley wines have a tendency to be a little higher alcohol content. Because if you really want to balance and not have the fruit overwhelm you, you need to have a little bit more alcohol content. But that barrel program of 40% new and 60% once used oak is what helps tame the tannins a little bit so that wine is a little bit more drinkable upon release. It'll still age, but this isn't the wine that you're going to be tasting 20 and 25 years down the road. I think you're going to enjoy it for 10 to 15.
Yeah, what you described from the Merlot grape in France, usually it's harvested like 2 weeks earlier than classical Bordeaux or something like this, and it also has a little bit lighter reddish color. It's not that dark, and I've learned that it sometimes really can have an impact if you keep it a little bit longer before you harvest it, and it can change completely the whole performance of the wine and the whole taste. And there are some advocates saying leave it a little bit longer, get a more heavier taste, and others, the more classical Merlot producers really keep the difference to the classical Bordeaux type of wine. That's quite interesting. But I think especially the Napa Valley also gives, I think, the deep fruity character, which maybe what I said in the beginning, that it may attract, it gives a more feminine feeling to have it a little bit deeper fruit characteristics. I don't know. Yeah, it's just what could be. So when we think about that. Again, coming back to what we said before, what kind of food would you advise or would you prefer with that? Just plain steak, red meat, or I think it's a wine you can drink to almost everything because it bridges the light to the dark food, so to say, heavy and smooth. I think you can really enjoy it to any kind of food, even with fish. You can try it sometimes. It's not really by the book, but the characteristics of the wine may even give you that opportunity, don't you think?
I agree 100%, Gerd, and I think this wine, this Merlot in particular, and I hope everybody listening at some point in time gets it taste this, because you can see the dark ruby color.
Mm.
And, you know, when you get the, you know, the nice little, you know, dark fruit characteristics and black cherry and blueberry, and you get the kind of some perfume aromatics. And this is where a different barrel, where the toasting matters, because the vanillin that comes out of that oak barrel and really complements Merlot is absolutely wonderful. And this is a wine that will go with that great steak, but it'll also go with the more delicate meat like lamb or wild game. I mean, with pheasant, this is absolutely amazing, or with a nice pork loin. And I think, you know, especially with a little bit more oily fish, I think this is just absolutely beautiful.
Yeah.
And you'll find these wines are very versatile. I mean, there's some people that will drink this through the whole meal, but it's a very versatile wine. But I absolutely love it with various meats.
Mm.
Okay, well, thank you all for hanging in there and enjoying the second part of our Napa Valley adventures. I think on the next webinar, we're going to be heading to Germany with Professor Alfarth and Dr. Vance Thompson. So thanks again, everyone, for participating. Lee, Michael, John Marshall, and Sufi Tanari. We'll be back in October for webinar number 9. Have a good evening and weekend.